99X, it's Barnes and Leslie. You know, big story, Leslie and your sleaze, has been this whole Armie Hammer situation.
Right, and then Armie, of course, went on with Piers Morgan uncensored.
Yeah, and I spoke very clearly when I said he should not have been canceled for having a little fun maybe in the bedroom that other people don't agree with. But the whole cannibal thing, nothing was proven. And you can read a lot more about that type of stuff in an upcoming book called Hammered. And by who else? His mother. Please welcome
Dru Hammer.
Dru Hammer. Hi, Dru.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Congrats on your book, which is out now, which is brilliantly called Hammered.
That was just too tempting with a name like Hammer, because every heart has been hammered in one way or another.
I can't wait to read your book. I know it's really candid about your life and everything that you've been through. And also there's a beneficiary as well to this that we'll talk about in a second. But how long did it take you to write this book?
Well, it's a little embarrassing to tell you, but it actually was 10 years in the works, because I started out journaling because I was just so hammered and I was just so heartbroken, and I just kept crying out to God, help, you've got to help me. And I would just journal. And then when I journaled, I realized all these miracles started happening as I was seeking the Lord and drawing closer to Him. And, I would tell my friends about it, and they're like, oh, my gosh, that just couldn't happen. You've got to write a book. And I'm like, well, I got a D in my first English paper in college, so I don't think I'm the right one to write a book. So that's what I love about God. He chooses very unlikely candidates.
So I'm assuming by the timeline, you started this book like right after you got divorced?
I did. I started just writing down and journaling because I realized that bitterness is just something that eats people up. And if you don't forgive, it'll just absolutely destroy your life, not the other person.
I would watch dropping the eats people up reference. That might be one. You might want, you might want to stay away from that one.
Oh, you're so right.
That might be... You might want to strike. We'll get to that in a second, but just for people that don't know, the Hammer family goes back with a very, very rich legacy, and I'm not just saying money rich, but so the grandfather was Armie Hammer, right?
Yes, and I met Michael, his only grandson. Armie only had one child, and then he had two children, Michael and his sister, and I met Michael on an airplane. I was playing in a tennis tournament in Houston, and it was one of those situations where we literally looked each other in the eyes and fell in love. And he kind of came from a crazy background, boarding school and the whole thing. And I'm from this Pentecostal background. So he took me to dinner, and I started telling him about the Lord, and he'd never met anybody like me. So long story short, I ended up leading him to Christ, and we got married within 4 months. And next thing you know, I moved to LA, and I thought, oh my gosh, I've landed in the Twilight Zone. It was a very different world than what I was used to.
Well, I love that you've been very outspoken about your son, Armie Hammer, and talking about, you said what he did was morally wrong, but he's not a criminal.
Well, I met these girls. One of them stayed in my house over Thanksgiving. And I say in my book that, he saw them they saw Armie as Mr. Right, and he saw them as Ms. Right now. And when he was done, he was done. He would break their hearts. And he says, I might have taken advantage of the situation, but I did not criminally abuse anyone. Everything was consensual. And, when you get women together and they collude, if you will, then I'll tell you what, it can go crazy on you. And I just think it was the perfect storm because, the whole cancel culture, the whole Me Too movement, people were locked in their houses and apartments because of COVID, and it just became this feeding frenzy. And I'm like, wow, do you know what you have to do to be a cannibal? You have to actually eat people.
Yeah.
So it was just so crazy to me that all this happened. And, the rape accusation was ridiculous because after she accused him of that, he had over 100 texts of her stalking him. And as soon as Armie turned that over to Gloria Allred, she dropped the case because there was no case. And, but then the feeding frenzy continued. It was just crazy.
We're talking to Dru Hammer. Her new book is out called Hammered, about her life. She's also Armie Hammer's mother. So you said you saw these girls coming and going. Did you ever say anything to him about it because he was married?
Well, of course I did. I raised him in the ways of the Lord, and he grew up in church, and he actually was molested when he was 14 by his youth pastor. So I think a lot of that was acting out. There is no excuse. And trust me, he would get on shows, and he was actually, they were separated for 2 years with these other two women. I'm not justifying it's still wrong. He was not divorced. But he would get on, for example, Jimmy Kimmel and go, my mother is going to hate this story. And I would call him immediately. And I'm like, you're right. I hate that story. It's not the way I raised you. I raised you in the ways of the Lord. So I absolutely, tried my hardest to hold him accountable. But, I always say there's no grandchildren in heaven. We're all responsible for our own lives.
The story about him, I'm sorry he was molested. Is that story out there? Because I have not heard that before.
Yes, he actually speaks about it. And I write about it in my book. And I sent him the chapter. And I said, look, this is your life. I've never spoken up before about your story. I stayed quiet. But now that he's come out, I said, are you okay with this chapter? And if there's anything you want to take out, we'll take it out. And he called me immediately and said, Mom, I'm so proud of you. I think it's perfectly said, and I wouldn't change anything. And I believe that's part of my platform, is I did not do well as a parent at that time because, I really want to teach parents that these, molesters, they groom children. They groom the parents, and they make you think that they're your best friends. So you trust them.
That's true.
And then Armie was ashamed and told us that he was uncomfortable going because the youth pastor had tried some things, but nothing had happened because he was ashamed. So I should have been much more proactive at that time. So I'm really praying that God gives me a platform in that area because I'd love to teach parents because I've been there.
I'm surprised kind of that Armie allowed you to open all this up in the book. I'm looking forward to reading this. It is out now. It's called Hammered. Dru Hammer, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
The Morning X with Barnes and Leslie, 99.